Back with a new haircut and we're back on YouTube. Okay. So I know not much of a what do we call it? Heads up with this. But, kind of had a crazy week, but I am very excited to talk about diabetes. I know not everyone's most thrilling topic, but it's really important because it's just becoming more common and we need to have answers to problems that are fixable. And I mean, I will, we could just start with this. Diabetes is 100% reversible. Type 2 diabetes is 100% reversible. You can do it. It is an earned disease. Same thing with heart disease, same thing with a lot of things that start with a C, and it's not has anything to do with an injection, but I can't talk about that here. And that's a talk for another day. And unfortunately, would have to happen either offline or personally because you cannot talk about that. And that's not something I'm going to get into. But what we are going to talk about today is insulin resistance and diabetes. This is just something you earn over time. And if we don't get back to a space where we are taking responsibility for our health, we're going to end up going down the road we're going right now. And if you're listening to anything that I'm posting here, as you can see, that is a crazy, wild world. If we give away our responsibility for our health, you can see where this goes. And if you want to be reliant on a system that is broken, by all means, you can go do it. But the truth is, this is not something that we need to research in terms of finding a cause, is because it is something that we already know. It just comes from the life we live. This is something that is earned. And the sooner that we come to that conclusion and we can accept that, the sooner we can get to real causes, real solutions, and more importantly, make a big difference here. So, insulin resistance. So, what do we know about it? We know that, again, these are old statistics I got from 2014. They were measuring between the years 2001, 2009. So 3% of the US population had insulin resistance. That's back then. But it was a 30% increase among children and adolescents. So we know this is becoming a bigger problem with kids. We also know that type 2 diabetes is increasingly diagnosed in youth and now accounts for 20 to 50% of new onset diabetes patients. In other words, kids are getting insulin resistance, kids are becoming obese, kids are becoming on the route to diabetes, which is really a poisoning, and we'll get to that, a poisoning of the blood earlier on in age. We also know there is a huge correlation with insulin resistance and symptoms of PCOS, or symptoms that have to relate to the menstrual cycle. There is a huge correlation between the two. So anytime I'm dealing with, a woman, and we're going with two genders today, a woman. The one of the first questions I'll ask about is blood sugar. Or they know anything about it, or are there cravings for sweets or anything like that? Because if that is the case, then that is very likely playing at least some role in what's going on underneath. So whether it's fibroids or PCOS, or anything related to that. Blood sugar is related. There is a pretty heavy correlation with it. We know now that at least 25% of adults have metabolic syndrome or would be considered to. We also know that that managing diabetes for 1 year costs over $6,600 per year. So again, when I get all these comments that eating healthy is expensive and I can't do it, you have to understand that these costs are going to come out one way or another. That's just going to happen. And you're either you're living it and increasing your quality of life now, or you're going to be paying for it later. And it's just kind of a way it's going to work. So what are we doing? What is the main reason, or what is our way that we attack this? What is our way that, the conventional system will go about treating this? And there's drugs out there, things like metformin. So, there have been recalls for metformin in the past. In fact, as far back as 2020, such a long time ago, there were some. So we know that the FDA, it did recall some of them. More than 175 different drug combinations have been recalled since late May 2020. The FDA says patients taking metformin products that have been recalled should continue taking their medications until a doctor or pharmacist gives them a replacement or different option. It could be dangerous for patients with type 2 diabetes to stop taking medication without first talking to their doctor. So there is something that causes a problem, but continue to take it because it might make things worse. Even though we already know that this is essentially something that is completely earned and is essentially a poisoning of the blood that causes an issue. Um, it's just kind of backwards how we look at this stuff. So, so what else do we got here? So, like, we know that when it's interesting when you see these drugs, you always see that they're along like, oh, if you take this with diet and exercise, or it'll improve something with diet and exercise. The diet and exercise itself is the cure. It already is. It's kind of crazy, but what you'll hear from the FDA and our conventional, outlets is that it's dangerous to stop taking it. And listen, I can't legally tell you to take things or not. This is strictly educational, but the answers are there. Like they're already there. There are more things that we can do. And so when we're looking at drugs that lower glucose levels, because remember, when you're taking something like metformin, you're treating a lab symptom. You're treating a lab marker, not even a symptom. You're treating a lab marker. And if the marker comes back, we're good to go. Our hands are clean. But what happens is, again, when you look at some of these analyses, again, um, one looked at 34,000 patients, half were in a glucose lowering treatment and half got, a standard treatment. They found that for when there were reductions in glucose, it increased a 9% reduction in glucose was correlated with a 19% increase in all-cause mortality. And when there's a 14% reduction in glucose, there's a 43% increase in cardiovascular death. So what's happening? We're lowering blood glucose levels, but we're increasing death. Now, I did pretty good in math, but I don't think you need to be a math whiz to kind of figure this one out here. So if we're taking drugs to lower a symptom, to not even lower a symptom, to lower a lab marker, and not addressing the other stuff that's leading to it, if we're not asking someone what they eat, or how many bowel movements they have a day, or how they sleep, or how they breathe, then how are we going to ever get to the bottom of like what's going on here? It's kind of wild when you think about it in terms of like where you go. And what you'll hear is metabolic syndrome. You'll hear a lot about that. Now, metabolic syndrome, sometimes you'll hear it called syndrome X. It's usually it's like a constellation of markers or biometrics, some blood markers, some blood tests, some physical traits that can play a role. So for example, metabolic syndrome, if you have things like a fasting glucose over 100, if you have higher blood pressure over 130 over 85, and we talked about blood pressure last week, so go look at that. If your HDL cholesterol is under 40, if your triglycerides are over 150, and if you're a man, if you have a waist circumference over 40 inches, if you're a woman, if it's over 35 inches, if you are over those other numbers, you would qualify for metabolic syndrome. That's the diagnosis. But it's really not anything. It's just a constellation of different issues. And think about it. When we're looking at, HDL and triglycerides, we know that these things are associated with liver function. That's why you see a lot of people with insulin resistance or insulin issues tend to have issues with liver function, and they kind of go hand in hand. You'll notice that there's been a huge rise in things like non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, which is now the main cause of liver disease, not alcoholic, which is what it kind of used to be. It is, again, an earned problem that is due to lifestyle. So with metabolic syndrome, you'll see those markers. You'll see things like elevated triglycerides. You could see hypertension, like I mentioned. And again, we talked about this last week. That is a response to a stimulus. Are you in a sympathetic state? Are you in a sympathetic dominant state that is causing that? If you are constantly in that, it's going to cause issues down the road. It could potentially lead to hardening of the arteries. And when you don't have high triglycerides and you have higher LDLs and you don't have antioxidants to break those things down or to neutralize that, that can potentially lead to plaquing. And when you get to plaquing, that's going to lead to atherosclerosis. What happens? Blood pressure goes up, kidneys have to work harder, and now you're leaving yourself at a higher risk for things like cardiovascular disease. So if we're not putting it all together, if we're not taking the holistic approach and just saying, hey, man, your blood glucose today is 125. We're going to have to put you on metformin. And that's it. And we're not asking how you're sleeping, how you're breathing, how you're moving, how many bowel movements you're having a day. If we're not at least asking those questions and getting to the bottom of it, then we are going to miss the big picture with this. And we already know. So it's estimated, if we're not there already, that at least 1/3 of all Americans will develop diabetes. We know 95% plus of it is type 2, which is 100% reversible. 100%. You can reverse it. Now, I'm not going to sit here and say that, if you get to a point where you kick the can down the road long enough and you have gangrene in your toe, not going to get that back. But you have a long time before you can do that, before it gets to that point. This is already a huge burden. And now when we talked about Alzheimer's a few months ago, Alzheimer's is called type 3 diabetes. And again, it's because of this insulin resistance, this high glucose state long term is inflammatory and eventually affects the brain. And this will start negatively affecting it 30 years before you even show any symptoms. So I'm 30 years old. Like, if I don't want to start losing it when I'm 60, like, what I do right now matters. And that stuff always matters and plays a role. So you have to take that into account. And that's why, again, I talk so much about, the nervous system, and not so much as, it's finding that balance between the parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system. The sympathetic is great because it's made to keep us alive during stress, but part of what it does is it will elevate blood sugar. Why does it do that? We have to release glucose into the blood so we can get it to muscles, so we can run or we can fight, or what we need to do in that moment. But we're supposed to be able to shut it off. And if we don't shut it off, part of the reason why glucose can be high is because we're in this stress state all of the time. Now, are you necessarily hearing that when you go to the doctor's office? Probably not. But you need to keep that in mind, because we need it. Glucose is that form of energy we run on. So if it's high due to a stress, or if we're stressed out all the time, or we had a fight with our spouse, or we're having trouble at work, or there's some other stress that is bothering you at the time, that could be a reason why blood glucose levels are high. The other thing that it does is, when you're in the sympathetic state, you're either in the rest, repair, digest state, or you're in the fight or flight. You can't be in both. So you have to be able to downshift when you need to, so you can heal, so you can repair, so the immune system can do its thing. If we're constantly in this frustrated, running, always go, go, go state, that stuff's always put on the back burner and it doesn't get done. So it's important to understand that. So what is causing this? Well, obviously the food is. So we know that anything, first of all, any of this man-made stuff, good rule of thumb is, if man made it, you probably shouldn't eat it. We know there are toxins in the conventional food supply, things like glyphosate, herbicides, pesticides, that are going to affect your pancreas, that are going to affect your hormone production. And remember, insulin at the end of the day is a hormone. So when this gets affected, it's going to negatively affect how efficient we are at dealing with this stuff. Different chemicals and endocrine disruptors. Okay, remember, endocrine, hormones. Part of that system is going to be how we deal with blood sugar. So if we're having genetically modified foods that are sprayed with glyphosates, or if we're throwing a ton of conventional makeups and soaps and shampoos and cleaners, all of that is going to affect that system over time and can potentially contribute. We already talked about chronic stresses, physical, chemical, emotional. All three are going to affect it to some degree. Certain medications, so cholesterol medications can make it worse. Hypertensive medications can potentially make this worse too. So we gotta get that stuff dialed in terms of causes. Injectables can do it too, because why? This is going to affect your gut integrity, particularly when you're talking about injecting things like heavy metals. This is going to affect the permeability of the gut, and that's going to in turn affect our immune system and how we deal with various external threats. Let's go with that. So really what it is, we know that it's interesting. So back like in the 19th century, like we called it the sugar disease, but like today, learning a little bit more, we know that a big part of type 2 diabetes is actually a failure to metabolize fats and oils. And think about that. Think about that for a second, because we talked about before how the liver, there is a correlation between liver health and diabetes. In other words, if you have issues with high blood sugar, you're much more likely to have issues with liver, i.e., non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, and issues that go down that road, whether it's cirrhosis or fatty liver and things like that. What if like part of the other way was playing around? Because think about this: with fatty acid metabolism, the body would much rather run on glucose, and a lot of this stuff we have gluconeogenesis. In other words, you create glucose out of things that aren't sugars. If we're consuming a lot of these GMO corn oils and soy oils and genetically modified things that puts a burden on the liver, some of that excess stuff can get converted to glucose. And if it's not stored, it's going to be stored in fat, or it's going to potentially cause a little bit of a poisoning. So is type 2 diabetes effectively a poisoning from a lot of these man-made foods, a lot of these seed oils, a lot of these conventional products that could potentially be part of the root cause here? So it's a different way to look about it. And the point is, like, we have to remember that this is something that is completely earned. You cannot catch it. The family history, it's more of, are you more likely to do what mom and dad was doing than did you inherit something like that? So like, what's the solution? It's it's almost so simple. It's like kind of embarrassing. We have to get rid of the conventional grains and sugars, and we need to exercise. Now, sleep plays a role. Bowel movements are going to play a role, but it is that simple. I could just end this right now, and that's the answer. It's reducing the processed foods, getting rid of all of them, including the grains, including the sugars, including the oils, the modified oils, the GMO oils, the seed oils, and moving your body. And that's it. It's almost like it's pretty wild how much money we put into research on this stuff when the answer is right in front of us and it's so simple. Um, Listen, we're not programmed to be inactive. We're not made for me to be sitting in front of this computer all day. What I'm doing after this is I'm done with this after this today. I got some notes I got to do, and I'm calling it a day. But we know that the more sedentary we are, that's going to affect our lipid profiles, again, HDL, LDL, etc., triglycerides, and also our blood glucose. If we are stagnant, we're not utilizing and metabolizing these things properly. We know stress is going to do it. Why? Because that's going to increase blood sugar in the short term, because it's almost like that we have to, we're in that mode where we need that. Again, physical, chemical, emotional stresses. We talked about it. Injections and medications can do it. Are we deep breathing? Something that can downshift us. Exercise. You know, there's are we can we use a water filter where we're not exposing ourselves to as many environmental stresses? It doesn't need to be that complicated. It really doesn't. When you cut out the processed foods, the processed sugars, the burden on the pancreas is less. And when we include higher complex carbohydrates, more fiber, that's going to slow the release of glucose into the bloodstream, which gives your pancreas a chance to create the insulin it needs in appropriate levels. This does take some time, but you can start reversing this very quickly. The first couple days, the first week, the first 2 weeks might look a little wonky, but when you start incorporating this stuff, again, mostly plant based, increasing fiber, increasing complex carbohydrate intake, this stuff will even out. You have to give yourself the time and space to do it, and you got to move your body. That's it. But so it's like insulin. We talk about insulin when it's blood sugar related, but that's not the only thing that insulin is for. So insulin also helps us take the extra energy we need and store it um, for future. Insulin is one of the main, really only um, anabolic hormones that we have, other than growth hormone, human growth hormone. So it will help build you up. So it's really important that the pancreas can do its job, that can do it in a way that is most efficient. But when we add the extra stress from the general conventional toxic lifestyle we have, it's going to add quite a bit of burden. Speaking of some of that burden, again, we talked about some high blood pressure medications. We know that can lead to things like diabetes and weight gain, but they can also affect the beta receptors the beta cells of the pancreas. And the beta cells in the pancreas are the cells responsible for producing insulin. So if you're taking a drug to lower your blood pressure, which again, high blood pressure is just a response to a stimulus, that can effectively make or leave you more susceptible to something like diabetes, because it down regulates the effectiveness of the pancreas. Statins, we know this. So, Lipitor can increase it, Crestor. These can increase the risk of diabetes by taking things like statins. Cholesterol medications, we talked about that a little bit earlier. It's super, super simple. I mean, you can look into, things like the China study or Joel Furman, Eat to Live, or The End of Diabetes, I think is a book he has. Um, it's very, very simple and straightforward. And the answer's here. And everyone listening to this can take advantage of it. It doesn't need to be super complicated. The answers are there. We know things like glyphosate, um, different types of herbicides. These things effectively act like antibiotics. So maybe you might need to introduce things like probiotic foods. If we talk about type 1 a little bit, type 1 we consider an autoimmune issue. Remember, I've talked about issues a lot. They are usually gut issues due to some type of potential poisoning. Again, could be heavy metals, could be something that can happen, particularly in kids. But it's something that affects the gut, and it's got to be fixed appropriately. So again, what does that include? It includes things like probiotic foods and higher fiber, and again, going in that kind of direction. So other things that could potentially cause it. So there are things like advanced glycation end products that are essentially they're products of the cooking reactions that can increase the toxic load. Usually happens on when you cook things at high temperatures like meats or dairy products. It's that burning, that crisping. Again, if we're not getting the nutrition we need from antioxidants that can neutralize things like those free radicals, that's going to play a big role. So something else to like kind of keep in mind with some of this stuff. Hopefully, like this stuff starts to make some sense. Like the pancreas and insulin has a bigger job than just blood sugar, but it gets altered when we're consuming a lot of this man-made stuff, when we're consuming a lot of these processed simple sugars that are going to affect this negatively, and that's going to put a strain on things like either fat cells or the liver, and you can start to see the relation between the two. The reason these things are becoming more common is not due to bad luck or bad genes. It is the choices we make on a regular basis. Um, we it the more that we know now and the more that we can take advantage of now, the greater the difference that we can really help with here. Um, high fructose corn syrup, I believe, is the number one source of calories we have in America at the moment. GMO corn that is basically straight sugar. And you wonder why like we're having these issues. It's not an accident. It's not bad luck. It's not, some genetic issue. I mean, if you go back 4 or 5 generations, they just called it the sugar disease because they didn't even have a name for it. So you gotta look into this. Other things that can maybe help, look into things like chromium. So that's a mineral we need. Look for foods high in that. Usually those are going to be a lot of different like whole grains. And again, that certain beans and nuts will have it too. Cinnamon is really good. So especially if you're looking for like a sweetener replacement, obviously a little spicier, not exactly the same, but cinnamon is awesome. Berberrine's really good. Um, Gymnema is really good. And again, you could probably find a lot of these on my full script if you want. Bitter melon, fenugreek. All of these can be really helpful. Chlorella, goldenrod, golden seal. These are botanicals that can help, but this stuff, you need to do the lifestyle stuff. You got to change what you're eating. You got to really get out there and start moving because we don't need to keep spending millions and billions of dollars on research for something that is completely preventable. And, if we want to live in a happier, healthier world, it starts with, the responsibility that each of us take for our own outcomes. All right. That's what I got for today. Where's my YouTube page? That's what I got. I hope this was helpful. I try to put quite a bit of work into this and put all the gems into here for you. If you ever want to work with me one-on-one or dive deeper specifically into what's going on with you, shoot me a DM on Instagram, or you can email me at drvincentesposito@gmail.com. You could get the contact form on my website, which is insideouthealthwellness.com. And yeah, this is stuff that you can take control of and own yourself, and the answers are there. So my suggestion is do it, because if you try to wait for the government or some health organization to do it for you, you're going to end up as healthy as them. And if you take a look around, at least here in America, I would say the general health is it would get the needs improvement if we're talking about report card grades. Have a wonderful weekend. I'll talk to all of you later. Have a good one.